Here. You idle brat! Get back to your work! Directed by a violent push, Ella staggered along the corridor in the direction of the steaming, noisy laundry. She hated Miss Grint so much it was like a fire in her belly. But she'd show her. Just as soon as she was old enough, she'd get out of this place. And when she did, she was going to become rich, and she'd come back and she'd... The stone steps down to the laundry were steep and awkward in her ill-fitting shoes. She picked up her skirt and concentrated. "Oi! Where do you think you've been? Get hold of some tongs and lift those sheets out of that boiler." The woman shouting was in her 50s, her grey hair hanging in wisps around her perspiring forehead. Ella hurried past her to haul the dripping white linen out of the boiling water and, dodging the splashes, lowered it into one of the long wooden rinsing troughs. All the girls had to learn household tasks to prepare them for work outside, but it was heavy labour for young, thin arms. Glancing at the girl whose fainting act had caused the distraction that enabled Ella to slip away, she gave her a grateful grin. It would mean giving away her meagre supper tonight, but it had been worth it. As the carriage drew away, Letitia Fairchild relaxed into its padded seat, relieved as always that a stultifying visit, decreed in her father's will, was once again over. Despite herself, she still resented how even from beyond the grave he managed to control aspects of her life, although she had to accept that it wasn't his fault that some ancient relative had once fallen on hard times and spent a few years incarcerated in that gloomy place. He had never forgotten the unfortunates left behind, and her father, having benefited by the man's later wealth, had bequeathed to his daughter the duty of visiting the workhouse 4 times a year. Letitia was generous, but also had a keen head for figures, and knew that her questions caused not a little consternation, but she was assured from photographs she had seen that this workhouse was little different to any other. After all, the number of poor and homeless in London was vast, and no matter how large the amount of charitable donations to swell the public coffers, more money was always needed to house, clothe and feed the inmates decently. Enjoying the sound of the horses' hooves on the road, she gazed at the tall houses in the tree-lined roads leading into the city, feeling relieved as they neared her comfortable home in Hampstead. Not the smartest address in London, but, as her father had proclaimed, one that spoke of solid respectability and yet might disguise a gentleman's true wealth. She was entering the hall, her hand already raised to remove her hatpin, when the butler came forward. "Miss Featherstone is waiting in the drawing-room, madam. I told her that I expected you back shortly." "Thank you, Forbes. Please serve tea." She unbuttoned her coat, and passing it over to a waiting maid, swept into the large, handsome room. "Grace, what a welcome surprise." The woman seated on the deep-cushioned sofa raised a hand to pat her hair into place. "I didn't expect to find you out." "My duty visit to the workhouse. I've ordered tea, but I can't possibly take it until I've washed my hands. You'll have to excuse me a moment." "Of course." Grace frowned. "You didn't touch any of the inmates, did you?" Letitia turned at the door. "No," she said with an indulgent smile at the woman she regarded as her best friend. "I didn't touch any of the inmates." A few minutes later, as they indulged in tea and scones, Grace was brimming with a snippet of gossip. "Did you know that Lord and Lady Alloway have gone to Madeira for 2 months?" Letitia shook her head. "I did hear a whisper." "Of course, one can never believe all one hears, but apparently all is not as it should be in that household." "In what way exactly?" "Shall we say that it involves a certain French governess?" Letitia paused, her cup halfway to her mouth. "You can't mean it. Not Lord Alloway. He must be 60 if he's a day. The old goat." "Letitia!" "Oh, come on, Grace. We may be unmarried, but we're old enough not to be ignorant of the world." She glanced at her friend, who at 26 was a year younger than her. She had both a fair prettiness and a good cleavage, and it was widely accepted that most men preferred an English rose. Letitia put a hand up to her black hair, dressed in a chignon. Not only were her own breasts small, but handsome was perhaps the best word that could be ascribed to herself. She had to admit that her assertion